Welcome to the Jungian Anthology podcast, analytical psychology seminars from the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. Episode 2, Jungian Views on Aging with Lionel Corbett, M.D. This recording is the final segment of a larger lecture given by Lionel Corbett, and includes a lengthy question and answer period. Themes include the importance of the archetypes, primitive versus developed ego defenses, pre-egoic states, the storage of trauma in the body, and a discussion of the inner victim-perpetrator dyad, which predates Kalshed's work on the self-care system. Lionel Corbett, M.D., trained in medicine and psychology in England, and as a Jungian analyst at the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. Dr. Corbett is a core faculty member at Pacifica Graduate Institute, teaching depth psychology. He is the author of The Religious Function of the Psyche and Psyche and the Sacred, Spirituality Beyond Religion. He is co-editor with Dennis Patrick Slattery of Depth Psychology, Meditations in the Field and Psychology at the Threshold, selected papers.
Now, lest I get struck by lightning, I'm going to begin this with a dream. I should mention that the dreamer is in the audience, and after the break will be available for discussion. What I want to do is, first of all, show a slide which illustrates a part of the dream, describe the dream, then talk about aging from a general point of view, particularly a Jungian point of view, and then in the second part of this to amplify the dream on the basis of our understanding of aging. Okay, so can I have the slide to start with, please? Okay, now the dream occurs when the dreamer is in her early 60s. A voice informs me that it is now going to teach me about the process of aging. An illustration appears before my eyes. It represents the rejuvenated Godhead. Underneath it, live, is the head of a very old man. A connecting line is drawn from the old man's head to the divinity. The illustration is black on white, a sketch. So the illustration is a sketch, but the head is alive. There is an outer elongated square and an inner circle. At the bottom of the inner circle is a crescent. Out of the crescent arises two heads on long necks that look almost identical. I know they share the same body, which is not shown. The voice explains that this is an abstract of the rejuvenated Godhead. The right head represents the male aspect and the left the female aspect. The two heads are in absolute harmony with each other. There is something esoteric about them. They look like spirits, somewhat ethereal. I perceive their facial expression as aristocratic, blithe, somewhat curious, unemotional. They do not look authoritative, but the voice is. The top of their heads is shaped like an indented crown with three prongs that I can see on each head. The old man looks quite ordinary and sort of earthy. The voice explains that in our society we still do not understand the process of aging. And this is the very important part. The purpose of our maturation is to enable the Godhead to rejuvenate. If we could only understand that, when we are born, God is old. When we grow old, God becomes young. And when we die, God experiences rebirth. And this goes on, but not in the sense that the Godhead is feeding on us, but the whole thing is rather a natural process which is not yet too well understood. It is absolutely essential that, particularly in old age, we do not lose or have lost our connectedness with the Godhead, for otherwise we not only deprive God of our share in his rejuvenation, but may actually disturb the cosmic ecology, which in turn affects us. Ideally, so the voice says, we gain wisdom as we grow older, but only few people do. I understand wisdom to be a conglomeration of life experiences, a priori and acquired knowledge, and the awareness and acceptance of one's inner child. To accumulate knowledge per se is not all that important. Important is that we are connected with the Godhead or the Divine, and let it live within us even though it is also outside of us. Belief in a cosmic supreme being or power constellates the inner child. I hope this is making John Giannini happy. And thus furthers the divine rejuvenation process. If we ignore the divine element, it sinks into itself and ceases to be conscious of itself. Extremely important idea. As we grow older, we often lose the child, and as we lose the child, we are apt to simultaneously sever our ties to the divine. There was also some indication that the birth and the death process are actually the same, except that as little children we seem to be contained in the divine element, whilst in old age we are apparently expected to be a container for the divine element. Okay? Right, we'll have the slide off now, please. Can we have the lights on? This is a Xerox picture of that, in case people want to refresh their memory. Now, what I want to do now is talk about aging and try and explain eventually what that dream means, about try to amplify it. So let me begin by, it sounds rather mysterious at first. I want to talk about old age as a developmental process. Now the first point that I want to make is that it's clear that as we get older, there are a series of different demands that society makes on us, our bodies alter, and constant adaptation is required. Interpersonal relationships change their quality, our career interests and our avocational interests all change. And the problem is, how do we move out of midlife into old age? How do we accomplish that transition? Now there are very popular stage theories about life. And these stage theories say that at certain times of life you have to do certain things. You have to go to college when you're in your early 20s, you have to get married in your 20s, and so on. And the difficulty with this is that attitude of the stage theory tends to turn description into prescription, and people start to feeling that if they're not doing the right thing at the right time, that somehow there's something wrong with them. This, of course, is a mistake, and it's very clear that sometimes young people are faced with tasks in their life that really belong to late life. And nowadays the elderly can go to school or they can start new families, and so this has increasingly become what's called an age-irrelevant society. This rigid stage theory is slowly going out. But even bearing that in mind, it's clear that as you go through different stages of the life cycle, there are new circumstances in each stage. And development always requires two things. It always requires that you relinquish something, that you let go of something, and that you learn something new. If you think of it, the baby has to let go of the bottle and the diaper, has to relinquish that, and learn all the new tasks. And that is true at every stage. And the transition into old age is no different. You have to relinquish certain things, and you have to learn certain things. Now, we know a great deal about the first part of life, but nobody, until recently, has paid much attention to the last part of life because there weren't enough people to make it really worthwhile. And what's happened is that our attitudes in society about aging have really lagged very far behind what's actually the current reality about old people. And there's a great deal of prejudice that's called ageism, which is analogous to sexism or racism about the elderly. And this is particularly true, unfortunately, among doctors, because they see a very biased section of old people. They just see the sick ones. And many doctors particularly do not realize that in the last 20 years there's been a considerable increase in vigor and longevity in people over 65. It used to be thought, I'm not sure if this reaches the board. Yes, it does. It used to be thought that if you plotted vigor against age, that it was just a straight line down. And now what we know now is that in fact the real curve of vigor against age looks like this. And if this is 65 and this is 85, this vigor curve isn't a straight line down. I hope this is visible. It's more rectangular. Between 65 and 85, vigor is well preserved and declines only very slowly. And then it tends to decline rather rapidly after the age of 85. Now, it's that 20-year period, which is as long as childhood and adolescence, that's very, very important and it's become into prominence. The question is, what do you do during that 20-year period now? Since statistically, if you get to 65, you'll probably get to 85. Now, at one time, another misconception was that there wasn't anything you could do. That all you could do was choose your parents as carefully as possible because the gene package determined everything, and that was it. Now we know that that isn't true, and if you're reasonably careful about things like exercise and how you eat, nutritional factors and weight control and general health and social interaction, I won't go into all the details of that, but if you pay reasonable attention to those things, especially if you continue some kind of creative work and intellectual work, and particularly above all if you have a persistent sense of meaning, then certain modifications of the aging process can be postponed. Now, those things won't postpone whether or not you get cataracts or whether your kidneys start to age and so on. But the fact is that there are very large numbers of old people nowadays who are maintaining very good health and physical health, emotional health and physical health and creativity. And the stereotype of the demented, senile, deaf old person is no longer true. That only applies probably to 5% of the elderly population. 3/4 of them are living independently. and many of them are extremely well. Now, the other misconception is that all old people are alike. There, in fact, is enormous plasticity among old people. In fact, the degree of variability as you get older increases. It doesn't decrease. If you take a group of old people, they are much less like an age-matched group of younger people who all teenagers like the same music and the same clothes. All old people are not like that. Differentiation continues to increase. So heterogeneity increases. So it's not a period of remorseless decline. Certain functions decline, many functions do not decline. And especially in the psychological realm and the spiritual realm, continuous growth occurs. And this growth and development makes very, very exacting demands on the personality. It's not easy to do it properly. So what people used to do with that first curve that I drew is they used to generalize from this what is now known as the terminal period of decline into the whole of the aging period. That was the conceptual mistake they made. Now, because we don't know very much about the developmental psychology of late life, what clinicians do in particular is that they take criteria that are good for midlife and they apply them to old people. So, in terms of normality. Now that would be equivalent to judging a middle-aged person as if he or she was an adolescent. The developmental necessities are not the same. And it might be fine for a 50-year-old to be going to work every day and struggling still and so on, but for an 85-year-old to be going to work for 8 hours a day may mean something quite different. It might in fact mean that he or she is quite neurotic. So they tend to use norms that are not relevant to the age. And they don't know how to guide people into age-appropriate behavior. Now, because the culture overvalues youth and undervalues age, the unconscious assumption is that what you've got to do to be good in old age is constantly behave like a young person. Okay, so you have lots of television ads telling you about old skin and young skin, but of course, age spots are not on the skin; they're in the psyche. Okay. If you think that you constantly have to behave like young people, what happens is you get a developmental arrest, and you just get stuck constantly trying to behave like a young person, and you avoid what I'm going to talk about, which are the developmental tasks of late life. Now, the dream is partly about initiation into old age, about how you get across the threshold. Okay, so I'll talk about how you do that later on when I amplify the dream. But I want to go through rather quickly the developmental tasks of old age. Having gotten into it, what do you have to do? Now, the first point is that what happens to you in old age is partly a function of what happened to you in youth and middle age, of course. If you've always been character disordered and peculiar, you're likely to be character disordered and peculiar in late life. And the people say that if you want to be a nice little old lady, you have to start when you're 16. But you can. The point is that it's a continuous process, but you can make up for missed opportunities at any time. And also it's obvious that you need reasonable physical health and reasonable emotional health and reasonable economic circumstances, and good education helps very well, and very much, and a well-preserved social network helps. And the more you have of those, the more favorable are the chances to get into a successful old age. And of course people will have them to different degrees. So I want to go through the developmental tasks of late life, but I want you to understand that they represent ideal goals. It's like the idea of individuation. Nobody can quite do it, but it's something that one can think about as an ideal goal. It's impossible virtually to attain all of these, and I don't want to sound Pollyannish about it. Many of us can attain many of them. Now, the first point is the development of our unused potential. Early in life, because of the demands of work and marriage and school and so on, only a part of our personality is able to come into the world, but at some point the rest of the personality presses for recognition, and any unused talent that we haven't used so far can be started to be developed. The development of unused potential is one of the main developmental tasks. Now that's why having as broad as possible a cultural and educational base in young life is very important. The best thing you can do to help somebody into old age is to give them a reasonable childhood and as broad an education as possible, because then later on in life they can start to pick up threads that they may have started but had to drop earlier in life. Now this is also not only important in terms of things like playing the piano, but also things like unused psychological functions. Of course, this is referred to in Jung as the development of the inferior function. I'm sure most people here are familiar with typology, so I won't go into details. But people who've been good at being sensitive to people's feelings, good at relationships, good with children, might find it feeling types might find it important to start being involved in a discipline that requires abstract thought and rigorous thought. People who've always been very good at abstract thought and logical thought might start to work more on interpersonal relationships and their neglected feeling side. Down-to-earth, here and now, practical people, sensation types might take an interest in things like mythology and religion that are more dependent on intuition. And intuitives who've always been interested in ideas and possibility and living in the clouds might benefit from taking up something like gardening or photography or something which is much more hands-on and down-to-earth. So that's a kind of rough sketch, but that's actually terribly important because and that's one of the major things that I think one should do in late life, the development of the inferior function. It would take too long to go into detail about that. Now the other developmental task is the development of the contrasexual, which is what this dream is partly about. That is, in men the anima, and in women the animus. Now in our culture, fortunately, the difficulties attendant on doing that are starting to break down. And it's getting a little bit easier. I'll talk more about that later. Now, the second important task is simply the development of meaning. To look back on one's life and say, what does it mean? There are lots. When you think about your life, there are lots of thematic contents that seem to recur because we have complexes, we have neuroses, and because we have neuroses, we keep doing the same thing again and again. So we see patterns in our life. And when we look back and we think about all our suffering and our relationships and sacrifices and struggles, we can get, first of all, a sense of identity by looking at them all, but then by looking at the kind of patterns that we've weaved in the sense of life as a tapestry, we can start to understand a little bit more about what the meaning of our life. And then we can start to understand what is the relationship between what's happened to me in the world and what I've done and what I'm like on the inside, and what's the inner-outer connection. How has what's happened to me on the outside be the same as what's happened to me on the inside? This is called by Gerhard Adler the synthesis of nature and consciousness. Consciousness finally discovers what this particular nature was all about. Of course, psychologically sophisticated people in the Jungian community will start to see mythic themes in their own lives having been repeated, and then one is able to locate one's life against the wider cultural background. But this process, which is called Reminiscence Therapy, is not an easy process. It's very difficult. Initially, when you try and do this with people, the memories are very disjointed or they're very meaningless, and the discovery of a sense of process and the discovery of connections between events might be very, very difficult. Often all the events seem isolated and meaningless. And especially if there's a great deal of bitterness in the person's life, a great deal of guilt and grief can get stirred up. And when they start to look back and they see that the discrepancy between promise and achievement was enormous, they may feel actually worse. So this is not a process to be undergone lightly. It can in fact make people worse. And it can lead to despair. But when it's successful, then it leads to accepting of life without excessive regret, the capacity to let go of goals that cannot be achieved, and the refocusing of energy on what is attainable and on further development, as in this dream. The next important thing we have to do is maintain self-esteem. Now, as a general rule, self-esteem tends, in fact, to be maintained, in fact, to improve as we go through life, because our image of ourself and our sense of self-worth is constantly being increased as we gain in achievement, in ability and in talent, in relationships and money and so on. Things tend to get better. But in late life, of course, many of these things are not so available to us, and that's when self-esteem might fall. Now, it falls when it's very heavily dependent on factors such as appearance, physical beauty, or occupation or social status, because those things are harder to maintain in late life than qualities such as friendships, humor, wisdom, the fund of knowledge, experience, and so on. If your self-esteem is wrapped up in those things, then it's likely to increase. But if you're an aging narcissist who can't stand age spots, then you're in much more trouble. And of course, it may be very difficult to find new sources of self-esteem if you have considerable health and economic problems, or if you feel very powerless. Now, the next important task is the development of new roles and new responsibilities. And this breaks down, firstly, into family roles. Now, you have to change the relationship that you have with your adult children in late life. The extreme example of this is what's called in the geriatric literature role reversal, where the children have to take care of the parents. But it's often, usually in fact, not quite such an extreme change. But the nature of the relationship does shift, and you must allow the child to be an adult psychologically, and you must not hang on and prevent the child from growing up and being a person in his or her own right, which is often very difficult for some people. The other thing is in terms of dependency on the family, or dependency on anybody. Excessive dependency, of course, in early life or midlife might be very neurotic, but in late life, mature dependency, when it's really necessary, is very, very important. And if you can't allow yourself to be dependent when you need help, that's just as neurotic as a young person who's too dependent. So we like to think of interdependence being necessary. And refusal of that, for instance, might be problematic. The role of being a grandparent is very, very important. It's helpful for the grandparents, helpful for the child. It includes teaching, companionship, playing with the children, often in ways that are very much more relaxed than parents can afford to do. Telling stories about the family to grandchildren means that you are the historian of the family for the children, and this connects all the generations together. It increases the identity of the family, and it increases the sense of continuity of the children. So that's a very important role. Now, with regard to non-family roles, as friends and family die, of course, one's personal world shrinks. And that's when the risk of loneliness is very, very great. So the capacity for maintaining new relationships is extremely important. Even given that there can be no restitution for the loss of lifelong relationships. There's no way of working through, in the old-fashioned sense, grief at the loss of a spouse that you've been married to for 40 or 50 years. That the grief process is never fully finished. And in fact, that leads people sometimes to avoid the redevelopment of new intimate relationships in late life, because they say things like, how can you afford to get close to somebody again and risk all the grief happening again? Well, if you overdo that, of course there's some truth in that. I don't want to make it seem as though it's easy. It's not. But if you overdo that, you end up becoming very isolated and lonely. So some balance has to be achieved in there. Sexuality, of course, also ought to be maintained until very late in life. This is another one of the myths about aging, that it's not. There's a sexless old age. That's not true either. Sexuality ought to go on indefinitely. The drive to gets a bit less, but it never goes away completely. Unfortunately, there's a lot of ignorance in the culture about the normal age-related changes in sexual functioning, so people think that the pathology is present when there really isn't any pathology present, and there's a lot of social misunderstanding about that. So that's one of the last sexual taboos, sex in old age. There's still a good deal of prejudice about that. Maggie Kuhn suggested to me a list of new roles and responsibilities in the social sphere for old people whose time is not fully committed but who have plenty of energy, which is often the case. First of all, she suggests that they become educators and transmitters of knowledge. Now, one of the difficulties is, of course, that people think that the knowledge of old people is obsolete. Now, it often depends what kind of profession you're in. If you're in a profession like law or medicine, then your fund of knowledge is very valuable. And besides that, there are many forms of knowledge besides those found in textbooks that you can transmit to other people. Then they can be social historians and critics. They can caution against repeating old mistakes that they've lived through, and their experiential perspective on society is very considerable and unique if they will be listened to. But if they don't think they should be listened to, nobody will listen to them. So it's a two-way street. They can be workers for social change if that interests them, because they're very good. They tend to be very good at knowing the system. Maggie Kuhn likes to be a monitor of public bodies. Instead of calling herself a watchdog, she calls herself a watch bitch. Basically, what she likes to do is to make sure that politicians and public officials and so on are doing. But that's just her particular thing. But that's one example of putting one's energies into socially useful situations. And then being an ethical counselor is very, very important. Elder people can articulate the conscience and the moral standards of the culture with less risk of being accused of serving their own careers. David Gutman pointed out that during the Watergate era, the men who dealt with Nixon, Sirica and Irwin and Jaworski, were all rather elderly, and nobody could say to them they were just doing this because of their own careers. They already had their careers established, but they were, by virtue of their seniority, somehow able to carry the conscience of the nation. Then they can be futurists. A long life points beyond itself. And many, many old people are concerned about future generations. We have the image of the old man planting the acorns for new trees, which of course he won't live to see. But you can only do that if you are able to get above your own fears of death and change, which also is relevant to the dream. Now, the other important task is the discovery of new values. Now, Jung said that things don't happen for no reason in nature, and there wouldn't be such a thing as longevity unless it had a meaning for the species. He said the fruits of biological life are children, but the fruit of psychological life, especially in late life, is meaning. And what old people have to do is make meaning and make culture, make new ideas, and not compete with the young. They have a different responsibility, and their fecundity is a spiritual fecundity and in the production of new meaning, not competing with young people. It's very important because our culture in the first part of life requires competitiveness and assertiveness, making family, making social status, productivity, and so on. But there are huge pressures towards conformity, so it's very difficult in late life to say, well, I've done all that now, I'm going to stop doing that and I'm going to sit down and see what it all means. Because the tendency is not to encourage introspective values and the cultivation of the inner life and so on, and contemplation. These things are not valued in the culture, and it's hard to go against the tide of the culture. So if we want that to happen, we have to make that happen. That would be one example of making culture. Now, another thing is to develop wisdom. Now, the psalmist says, "So teach us to number our days that we may get us a heart of wisdom." In other words, it takes a long time to get wise, to get smart. Jung also wrote that the natural end of life is not senility, it's wisdom. Now, it's very hard to define. He said it means becoming who you are. Just aligning your conscious life with the stream of inner images so that the inner and the outer and your conscious synthesis of the two become one person. It just means developing the wholeness of the personality and becoming who you are, really. He also points out that wisdom, the antidote for suffering is wisdom. That bitterness and wisdom tend to exclude each other. So the more wise you are, that's why this is so important, the less you will be bitter and the less you will suffer. For other writers have written differently on wisdom. Kohut has written about wisdom being the acceptance of your limits, renouncing unmodified narcissism. Erickson, of course, wrote that wisdom is the detached yet active concern with life itself in the face of death. His idea is that you want to convey to oncoming generations your sense of life's integrity and fullness and meaningfulness in spite of it being in the face of death. It's still worthwhile. You have to convey that idea to oncoming generations. That's his idea of integrity, instead of despairing and say, oh, it's all not been worthwhile. Now the best definition, actually, which at first I thought was the most naive definition, is the definition of Meister Eckhart. But it's the hardest of all to achieve. And his definition is that wisdom consists in doing the next thing you have to do, doing it with your whole heart and finding delight in doing it. I find that probably the most profound definition, but the hardest thing, because usually what you have to do next is some crap that you don't want to have to do. So that's very hard to get to. But if you do get to it, then it has a certain meaning that we'll perhaps come to. The next point is the development of spiritual values. Now here I don't mean adherence to some kind of traditional religious creed or belief in dogma or anything like that. I'm not excluding that, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about this search for meaning and values and an attempt to understand the depth of experience and to transcend preoccupation with the personal and the local. That's very, very important. Now, if the traditional religion that you grew up in or acquired does this for you, then that's fine. But if those myths don't have the original energy that they had, then you still have to confront the meaning of life and death and good and evil and suffering and loss. And how do you do that? That is the pursuit of spiritual of meaning, of the spiritual life. So whatever your concept of divinity is, some kind of rapprochement with it, however it manifests in your life, is very, very important. In Jungian terms, of course, we call this contact with the self. A relationship with the self in late life is absolutely imperative. If this doesn't happen, old people become bitter and full of self-pity. And the dream is about how this is done. It's about how one way this is done. Okay, now I want to end this part by talking about a paper that was written last year by a man called Cole, who said that there is a hidden catch in criticizing prejudices about old age. If you emphasize a healthy old age and you say, oh well, lots of old people are healthy and that's wonderful, you perpetuate an unconscious dualistic attitude, and what you imply is that healthy old age is good and sick old age is bad. It's very dualistic, he points out. And he says, how do we imbue sickness and death and decay and those ill old people with moral and spiritual significance, to use it? How can we say that old people who are demented and ill and decrepit are still valuable and still meaningful? Okay. And not just say that only the well old people are what we want. We don't want to have a dualistic attitude. So that's what I think this stream is really all about. Now, as you know, in our culture, there's no transition into old age that's official, and many people become emotionally distressed when they feel that they're getting old. Now, if you accept the challenge, there's a great deal of opportunity for growth, as I've talked about. Excuse me. But lots of people decompensate at this time emotionally because they can't meet the challenge. Now, the reason for that is this. Hitherto, we've had sequential advancement. We've had more prestige and more authority as we've gotten older. Now, society wants us to go into a role with new norms, new values, and a risk of a fall in status. Sometimes this is triggered by retirement. So that a group of older people have grown up called the young old. And these are people who and they say that we're vigorous, we're healthy, we're not going to call ourselves old, we're the young old. Now, in fact, they exemplify this long steady state period that I talked about, that triangularization from 65 to 85. They don't decay. Now, what I think happens to those people is that this transitional crisis of moving into old age just gets postponed. They still have to face it emotionally. And they are examples of that dualistic attitude. I won't call myself old because old is bad. That's the point about the young old. And I want to get to the point where we can say that young is not bad, that old is not bad, that old is good. And that there's no need to call yourself young old because old isn't bad. Now, there are no social provisions to help you into this transition. There's a lot of turmoil, a lot of ambiguity, and you don't know how to do it. Now, we know from pre-technological cultures the importance of initiation into new parts of the life cycle. And the rites of passage that they perform are to help people move across the threshold. Now, they seem very primitive, but the rites of passage perform very profound social and psychological functions. They are not a coincidence. The study of pre-technological societies, the reason some of us are very interested in it, is it's like telling you about the human psyche seen in projection, in behavior, without the influence of culture. It's very, very important. The culture, the clan, validates the transition for the individual and says, yes, it's good for you to move into this new role. During the threshold period, which is a period of great anxiety and uncertainty, the rites, the ceremonies, offer the initiate protection. They give him a new set of symbols, and at the same time they connect him with the tradition of the tribe and the history of the tribe. We've always done it this way. This makes you part of the culture. So you symbolically often die and get reborn in the initiation ceremony. And then when you get reborn, you are reincorporated into the group with a new status and new responsibilities and new duties and so on. But you know where you belong and you know where you are and you've gone across the threshold. It's very difficult. Now, we don't have anything like that to take us into old age. We also don't have anything like it to take us into adolescence very often, or any other part of the life cycle. But the point about these ceremonies is to protect the emotional health of the individual and of the society, to make sure that people keep developing. Okay, and what you do is you integrate the biological necessity, the social necessity, and the psychological necessity to keep moving through the life cycle. That's what these rites of passage are for in primitive cultures, and we don't have them. And that's why people get screwed up at developmental epochs like adolescence and moving into old age and so on. Okay, so in our culture we don't have anything like that to help us get into old age. So in her early 60s, our dreamer has this dream. And I'm going to suggest that this is an example of what Henderson calls, in his book on initiation, auto-initiation, where the self motivates from within. The self knows, perhaps, that there's some difficulty about moving into this threshold period. And if nothing happens, she may regressively stay psychologically into midlife because of her anxiety about the future. So this image from the self comes up to initiate her. It's a symbolic impetus if she takes it seriously. And in that way she can reconcile, if she takes it seriously, her own consciousness with what Campbell calls universal will. Now, can we have this slide again, please? Now, so I think this dream is a miniature initiation ceremony, you see. It represents, I'll amplify it in more detail, the reuniting of a divine unity and the re-establishment of a state of totality. Let me explain why that is in a moment. It reflects the state of affairs prior to the creation of the individual, when there was no differentiation. And this state prior to the creation of the individual is now regained, but this time with the addition of consciousness. She's brought into relationship with an image of divine unity, which is one of the things that initiation does. It reveals the sacred to you. Now, while she's related to the sacred, she can transcend the personal, and at the same time she can emphasize her individuality. Okay? Perhaps also the dream, with its emphasis on death and rebirth, is addressing a lot of death anxiety which old people may have, and it tells her that her personal life, when it says, just to remind you, it says the purpose of old age is the rejuvenation of God, and as we get older, God gets younger, and when we die, God is reborn. That's the important image, that as we get older, God gets younger, and when we die, God is reborn. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, it puts her existence in relation to the eternal. Okay, it puts the death idea into a new perspective. And psychological transformation is often imagined in dreams as death and rebirth imagery. It illustrates a point of Eliade that initiation always gives death a positive value. His phrase is that death prepares for new birth into a mode of being not subject to time. So this emphasizes to her the transitory nature of chronological time, but images for her an ongoing relationship to sacred time and to eternity. Now, it initially reminded me of a statement in the Gospel of Thomas: for every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, this was not intended as a sexist remark. It was intended to point out the need to develop androgynous consciousness, this bisexual consciousness. You see, the other thing the dream said, if you remember, is that one head is male and one is female. Now, the Gospel of Thomas also reports Jesus saying that the kingdom of God is not a physical place and doesn't occur at a future time, but is found inside the individual. So the kingdom is actually an image of transformed consciousness. The way this happens is that the disciples say to him, "Shall we as children enter the kingdom?" You remember Jesus is speaking symbolically, as he did when poor Nicodemus came to him and says, "What's all this stuff about being reborn? How can you get reborn again?" And Jesus says, "Look, dummy, it doesn't mean literally, it means symbolically." Okay? And here it's the same thing. Jesus says to them, when you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, all these images of uniting, and when you make the male and female one and the same, then you will enter the kingdom. You will enter this place of transformed consciousness. Now, the Gospel of Thomas also points out, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. So if you don't get out the inner potential, that inner potential will turn toxic and kill you. So this is a clear image of the necessity to bring into the world as much of the potential of the self as possible. There's a nice comment in Lao Tse that amplifies this as well. He says, "He who knows the male and yet keeps to the female becomes like space containing the world. As space containing the world, he has the eternal power which leaves not, and he returns to the state of infancy." There again you hear the necessity for becoming both male and female in your consciousness, and how that returns you to a state of infancy. Well, I'll talk about that a little bit more. So here we have an image of a miniature model of the individuation process, completed, and also a mandala of aging, I think. So this is the answer to that criticism. This is how we imbue age with considerable significance. Now, what I want to do is go through the individual themes in the dream. First of all, the image of androgyny, the masculine and feminine Godhead. The Godhead here is half male and half female, or both, really. Of course, this is an image of what Jung calls the coincidentia oppositorum. The opposites unite, often imaged as a union of heaven and earth, of king and queen, and masculine and feminine. But the opposites come together without any conflict. In alchemy, of course, the great work consisted in the production of the perfect androgyne, and was often symbolized by male-female figures, the two-faced head of the king and queen, or the red man and his white wife. And you notice that the head of the man has a red tinge to it. So the Alchemical Opus, according to Jung, is a projection of the individuation process, and producing the Philosopher's Stone represents, in fact, the realization of the self, or all the opposites united. Now, Eliade says that hermaphroditism is an archaic form of divine bi-unity. In other words, if you look in mythology, particularly the creation mythology of many cultures, the initial divinity is bisexual. There are lots of images of that in mythology and religion and shamans. There's a image of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, in Cyprus wearing a beard. In Persian mythology, the god of time is androgynous. There are pictures of African and Egyptian gods that are bisexual. Zeus is often dressed as a woman. The Chinese god of night and day is androgynous. In the Kabbalah, the divinity has male and female aspects. And of course, the Tai Chi symbol from Taoism also expresses the same idea. In Hindu mythology, Shakti and Shiva are depicted as half male and half female, and so on. Christ in the Christian tradition is also imaged as an androgyne. Astrologically, we find the idea in Gemini, the twins. And in Plato's Symposium, he writes that man was initially created in the form of a sphere, 2 bodies and 2 sexes. Now, importantly, the hermaphrodite and the androgyne are not the same. In the Vision Seminars, Jung writes that the hermaphrodite precedes individuation. Okay, so this is an androgyne, not a hermaphrodite. Now, what's the difference? According to Charles Pensée, the hermaphrodite is an image of masculinity and femininity joined in a sexual body. But the androgynous state is an image of the archetypal realm in the subtle body with differentiated consciousness, in other words, conscious bisexuality. The hermaphrodite is unconscious, with an emphasis on genital sexuality. The archetypal is an image of differentiated consciousness. So the hermaphrodite would be the image of the unconscious union of opposites that you start with. The fetus, the human fetus, of course, the baby, eventually has masculine and feminine aspects to it, but it's undifferentiated and unconscious. And here in late life is the achievement of androgyny, where that process occurs. Instead of being physically and sexual, it occurs in consciousness. You see the difference of the differentiation and the awareness. Okay. Hillman also points out, by the way, when he's talking about Dionysus, that he was a bisexual god, and one of his main representations was as a child. So his idea of in the myth of analysis of the ultimate goal of psychotherapy is the wholeness of consciousness undivided into spirit and matter. Now, Edinger points out, interestingly, that consciousness etymologically means the same as conjunctio. Conjunctio, of course, in Latin means joining together. But consciousness means conscere, knowing with. So knowing would be the logos aspect, the thinking aspect, and the with implies withness or relationship or eros. So consciousness is in fact an image of conjunctio, of joining together, of uniting, of logos and eros, or masculinity and femininity. So it seems that when you unite logos and eros, the male and the female, that's how you make consciousness, which is what you have to do in late life. Edinger talks about consciousness as though it was a kind of fluid that you make. I'm not sure what it really is, but that's how it's made. It isn't made by the brain, that's for sure. There are unfortunately people who think that just as the kidney secretes urine, so the brain secretes consciousness. That is a gross misunderstanding. Okay, if anything, the brain just acts as a television set to kind of make the image clear, but the mind is all around us. It's not made by the brain. That's a very silly idea. Also, I found in Stan Grof's work the experience of androgynous consciousness during LSD trips, particularly when people were re-experiencing their original birth. Very interesting, because what LSD does, of course, is simply amplify what's in the psyche. It doesn't make something new happen. These drugs are amplifiers of mental processes. So that would be more evidence that this androgynous type of consciousness, where male and female are united and joined in an unconflictual way, exists as a potential in the human unconscious. In Grof's words, it's part of the map of the unconscious. It belongs there. So apparently, this archetypal potential was activated in our dreamer when it was necessary for her in order to help her further her development. It's like the self is saying, look, this is what you have to do next. I see the square. Now the square is an expression of quaternity, firmness, stability, honesty, integrity. Okay, I'll be square with me. Okay, he's a square. And an image of organization and construction. Okay, it's like a brick. It refers to matter, earth, and rationality. It's an old image of the order and stability of the world. It has 4 elements, 4 seasons, 4 stages of life, the 4 corners of the earth. So it's an image of God manifesting in matter, in creation. It may also represent, I think, death fixed as opposed to the dynamic circle of life and movement. But because the square has limits, it represents form and permanence and stability. Now the circle is often an image of the sun, of heaven and perfection, and of the self in its more impersonal aspects. It corresponds to an ultimate state of oneness, whereas the square, I think, more represents the plurality of man without any inner unity. And the Tai Chi, of course, says that there's always something of the masculine and the feminine, and something of the feminine and the masculine, and so on. Now, the circle is also an image of time in the sense of cyclicity, recurrence, birth and death, infinity, eternity, also of time, because it has no beginning and no end, time enclosing space, timelessness, no beginning and no end, and also of spacelessness, since it has no above or below. So you see why circles and squares were ancient images of divinity. Now, as the sun, the circle was masculine, but as the soul, it was feminine and maternal. So the circle, in fact, can be both sometimes, depending on the context. Now, the dream picture also has a sun-moon image. You see that crescent at the bottom is a moon, and of course the lost my thread. Oh yes, that was what I was going. Whenever Jung says that whenever an unconscious content becomes conscious, this is the equivalent of a conjunctio solis et lunae, an equivalent of a sun-moon conjunction. So this is constantly, in many, many different ways, imaging the coming together of these different aspects of consciousness, emphasizing the masculine and the feminine, the eternal and the temporal, the spiritual and the physical in all these different images. Now, squaring the circle, which is what happens here, the circle is squared, is an alchemical preoccupation about the relationship between the circle, which is the cosmic symbol of heaven, and the earth, imaged as a square. So it's an image of how do you unite the opposites into a higher synthesis where the opposites don't opposite anymore, where they now synthetically somehow a unity. Their idea was to obtain unity of the spiritual life and the material world. For Pythagoras, the square itself was an image of the soul. In the Hermetic tradition, the alchemical tradition, that square with the circle in the middle was an image of the anima mundi, the soul of the world. So you have an image of the soul of the person, and of the soul of the world. You see how many, many superimposed images of apparent opposites joined together in an attempt at synthesis. It's a profound mandala of the joining of all these opposites. Jung also wrote about this squared circle as being an image of salt in the alchemical literature. It's a double totality symbol. You see, the circle represents non-differentiated wholeness, and the square discriminated wholeness. Now, salt in alchemy was one meaning of salt was as soul, used by the alchemist to mean soul, to mean understanding and wisdom, and relationships if the salt has lost its savor, and so on. So it means relationships, understanding, and soul. And Christ, sometimes in the Christian tradition, is spoken of as the salt of wisdom, that which makes wisdom, and so on. Now you see the triangle. There's an implicit triangle. It's missing on this side, but there's clearly an implicit triangle here. And you see there's a figure missing on the right side there, or the left side, depending on the man's left side. There's a missing figure, and guess who belongs there? So the base of the triangle is between what should be the two human figures. Now the triangle in alchemically was an image of man. It was an image of soul, body, and spirit. And the triangle in a circle is an image of forms held within the circle of eternity. When it's pointing upwards in alchemy, it was an image of fire going up, an image of ascent, and the urge to get up from below. Now, a circle within a triangle, within a square, if you can imagine that, is an image of the relationship, the triangle, between the square as earth and heaven as a circle, how those things are brought together. So that, I think, is reflected here as well. And the implied triangle, I think, is, you see, if you finish the triangle, I think you'd put the dreamer's head down there and finish the triangle, and then you'd have an image of relationship between humanity at the bottom and divinity at the top. And that, of course, is what is called in Jungian psychology the ego-self-axis. I think that that's not a good term, and it perhaps should be called, I think, the ego-self-analog, because there's an analog of humanity and divinity implied here. It's not simply an axis, it's more of an analog. But that's just my opinion, that's not official Jungian theory. Now, I want to talk a little bit. How much time have I got? Who's the timekeeper? Can I go on for another 5 or 10 minutes? 5 minutes? You're getting bored, I haven't got to the child yet, John. Just wait. I'm going to get to the... Now I want to talk about the transformation of the self, or the transformation of God, and the creation of consciousness in late life. Now, in the second part of life, you don't need to be as rigid about yourself as you do in the first part of life. In the first part of life, to build ego, to build reality and a place in the world, you have to develop preferentially, as I talked about. But you can let go some of that defensiveness and rigidity in late life, and you can widen your identity and your sense of who you are. And the more you do that, the more you discover your full potential, of course. Now, all your full potential was present when you were a baby. And what you're trying to do now is realize more of it in late life. You had to sacrifice it for the sake of adaptation and ego development. There's nothing wrong with that. Now the child, to answer finally John Giannini's question, the child is often imaged by Jung as a symbol of the self. Now, Jung also talks about the hermaphroditism of the child, because the child is sexually undifferentiated. It's his equivalent of Freud's polymorphous perversity. So it's an image of pre-consciousness in early childhood. And of course, what he calls the post-conscious essence of the child, by analogy, is an image of life after death. But anyway, the child is an image of psychic wholeness, but undifferentiated and relatively unconscious. Okay. Now, just as there's an inner child or archetype of the divine child, so I believe there's an archetype of aging or an inner elder. Okay. And just as the child can be imaged as hermaphroditic in that undifferentiated sense, or certainly the fetus can, so the old person can be imaged here ideally as androgynous. And that's one of the meanings of the phrase God gets younger. As we get older, God gets younger. The self in late life, finally got to the point, the self in late life becomes as androgynous as the self in childhood. Okay. The self in late life when becomes as androgynous as the self of childhood. So the dream images God as an androgyne and invites, I think, the dreamer to develop likewise. So if she takes her rightful place in this relationship, she'll complete the analogy of divine to human. Now, God gets younger also refers to the fact that the self in late life becomes more similar to the self in the primal self, the self in infancy, because that self in infancy contains all potentials, but without the boundaries and the categories. What ego consciousness does is it makes categories, but they weren't there in infancy. So in both cases, in the self in infancy and the self in adulthood, all those opposites and conflicts are all there, but in late life, the self is incarnated, it's come into flesh, it's come into the world, it doesn't just exist as potential, and it's been transformed by human consciousness, by ego. So individuation means, on the one hand, incarnation, and on the other hand, differentiation. It means both. And as the images come up from the unconscious throughout life, as revelation, that makes new consciousness possible, and ego consciousness makes that process happen. So it's the ego-self relationship is circular. So the self births the ego in childhood. The ego somehow comes out of the self, but then in late life the ego returns the complement, because then in late life it's as if God makes God makes the baby in childhood, but in late life it's reversed, because as ego consciousness develops, it helps more self to come into the world. I hope that's clear. Now the self in the baby, of course, is very old. This is Jung's 2 million-year-old man, but it's relatively unconscious as far as the baby's ego is concerned. So by realizing its potential, the developing ego allows the self to constantly get born, and this is what Meister Eckhart means by the birth of God. Now, one of the major difficulties that we have is that the ego thinks that the ego knows how the individual ought to be, because the difficulty in old age is that the losses of old age and the physical changes of old age change our identity, and we get very upset. But we are not who we think we are, and it's very important for us to let go of our ego ideas of who we think we are, and not have too fixed a self-concept, small s self-concept, because we need to discover more how the self thinks the ego ought to be. So the function of old age is the culmination of this lifelong process of clarification, what Floyd or Scott Maxwell calls discovering your essence, and making conscious all the disparate parts of yourself with the aid of ego consciousness, or as Jung says, helping the creator to become conscious of his creation, or developing the ego into a model of the self, which it really is, or as he quotes Silesius, I am God's child and son, and he is mine, and that's what that means psychologically. So the self that's present at birth can become more conscious of itself throughout life. And then psychological development and spiritual development are absolutely synonymous. Only the words are different, but the process is the same. Now what about suffering in late life? Well, as Edinger points out, suffering at any age can be understood by the ego as the attempts of the self to incarnate. The way it feels to the ego when we're suffering is unpleasant, but it's often simply God trying to incarnate. It means this process trying to occur from below, so to speak. Because the ego doesn't know the intention of the self. If the ego knew the intention of the self, it wouldn't hurt so much. And Jung writes about this. He says, as we extend our consciousness into the unconscious, we contact spheres of a not yet transformed God. So as the ego in later life brings this material up and thinks about it and articulates it, that helps to transform the self, or helps to transform the as yet unconscious God, or aspects of the self. I don't mean God literally here, I mean the way Jung meant it, as an image of God in the psyche or the self. Okay, so the losses of old age, which seem very painful, actually enhance our own differentiation. And we have to take, as Jane Wheelwright says, we have to take back our projections from the world. We project onto the world the way we think it is. When all those things die off, those projections have to be taken back, and we see things the way they really are. And we have to find what was lost on the outside symbolically on the inside. And that's the idea of finding the whole world in the microcosm. Or as the Gospel of St. Thomas also says, whoever finds himself is superior to the world. Okay, let's stop for a break. Somehow. Does anybody have a question? Yes, sir. The question is, what do I think about the demented old? I was making the point that we should get rid of the idea that sick old people and demented old people are somehow bad, and that only a healthy old age is good. That's the dualism that we have to get rid of. And we have to try to understand that the whole process is important. Now, the problem is, how do you imbue a demented old person with spiritual value or moral significance or something like that? And I understand the difficulty that I haven't got to that point yet, because the demented old person can't have this kind of consciousness by definition. So he loses the capacity to do this. In a way, of course, he becomes like a child again. He needs being taken around, help with toilet, often diapered. He doesn't know anything. His intelligence falls. So I suppose you could see dementia as a sort of organic regression to childhood. But I don't think that quite does it somehow. I just want to, I don't know how to do it yet, but I want to get to a point where we can find some kind of spiritual significance even in that, but I can't do it yet. Okay. Yes. The demented person has to be taken care of, and that gives another person an opportunity. But that's not much help to the demented person, or is it? Allowing somebody to take care of you might be important for their development in some way. That's possible. Consciousness. Yeah, that's the problem with dementia. There's no ego consciousness left. Yeah. That's a very good point. So that the demented person is behaving in a way that's going to help the consciousness of the culture, the wider culture.
You certainly can consider
Yeah.
the dynamics of all the practice shifts and whatnot, and if you project that, you're going to have a number of older people in the society.
Mm-hmm.
In our population particularly.
Yeah.
And those issues are going to have to be faced. And people are facing
Oh, I see. So that's a very good point. Now that point is that we're thinking of the demented person too personally, and we should think of it as a social issue, and the collective consciousness has to deal with that. And that's a very good point. Maybe that's what it has. Maybe that's the meaning of it. That the demented person has to heighten the consciousness of the collective in some way. Well, I don't know. I'll think about that. Thank you. Yes.
suggested that the best preparation for a rich, older age is a rich childhood. And I wonder if that would generalize to all aspects of life, all periods of life, that living the richest possible life would be one. Or aren't there, in addition, things one can do as one approaches older age to more specifically work at that task?
Yeah. The question is, apart from having a good childhood, what else can you do throughout life to help old age to be fulfilled? And I think that it's being as broad as possible in your own development in terms of creativity and interests and social things and your development of your inner life, so that when you get into old age, you've got a lot of possibilities to draw on that you're aware of. Maybe some of them you're only dimly aware of, but that it doesn't seem like there's nothing left for you. So that being interested in several things, or deeply interested in a few things, the main thing is not to get there and think there's nothing left for me to do, which some people do when they keep working. All they've done all their life is work, and then when they stop working they get depressed because there's nothing left. So not doing that is very important. Not being one-sided. Organic brain syndrome does in late life is it heightens attributes of the personality, it emphasizes them. So what you're seeing probably is the way the person always, this is true of aging in general actually, that aspects of the personality become intensified. So probably the proclivity for that was always there, and now the higher brain functions or ego controls have been removed. You're seeing the erupting into behavior of stuff that they used to be able to keep the lid on. But because of the brain disease they can't.
How does this fit with some of the theories of living out various God aspects of God?
You mean what's the mythic equivalent of dementia? Well, I mean, there's stories of Tithonus, for example. Actually, the Tiresias story is also important in this. The Tiresias story is the story of a man who was made blind, and as a compensation for that, in late life, he was given the gift of prophecy, which is an image of insight and foresight. So the image is that if you lose physical sight, you gain spiritual sight. And Tithonus was a character who had an immortal lover who didn't want him to die, so she asked for him not to die, but she forgot to ask for eternal youth, so he just kept getting older and older. And in the end he got older and older, more and more shriveled, and there are a couple of endings to the story. One is that he's in a room somewhere still begging to die. And that would be an image antithetical to the opposite to the Tiresias story, which is an image of successful aging. The other end is that he was turned into a grasshopper. But so one is an image of successful aging, and your demented person might be the equivalent might be Tithonus, where you just beg to die but can't die. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we think it's very beautiful. And somewhere it's in our attitude that must be
Yeah, right. Well, there's a relationship between understanding and forgiveness. The more you can understand, the more you're likely to forgive. And you understand children much better, so you forgive them much more readily. So maybe that's the key, that we don't understand the demented old person enough, and we don't forgive them, and that's why we get so angry with them.
Or they get angry with us.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, in the case of an old person who was not institutionalized, but who is in fact beginning to express the inferior functions more and more, is it not possible that would make the other members of the family around uncomfortable?
Oh yes.
Kind of seen those
Yes.
things?
Yes.
So that there would actually be a lot of pressure not to do that. In other words, not to individualize.
Right. There's a lot of pressure not to develop. Yeah.
From the
Yeah. Terrifying. There is a lot of pressure for old people to stay the same and not be different, because it makes everybody uneasy around them. And if you've always seen your mother or father behave in a certain way and suddenly they take up motorcycling, it can make you frightened. There was a joke about that with this old lady on a big, powerful motorcycle tearing down the freeway, with a young man sitting on the seat, clutching her behind her, saying, "But Grandma, what did the psychiatrist actually say?" But it does scare people, yeah. But we have to make culture, you see, that's the point. There are all these terribly outdated ideas about young people, and it's this kind of thinking about it and developing a new consciousness about it that will make things different. Spread the consciousness. The difficulty is that old people buy into the prejudices, and they think they shouldn't change and they should be the same. And that's why it's difficult. I mean, I would imagine these ideas might be rather unpopular. Just as in Freud's time, the idea of the de-repression of sexuality was unpopular. So in our time, the idea of the de-repression of spirituality is unpopular. Okay, and now you can talk. Then you couldn't talk about sex at a dinner party in Victorian times. And now it's difficult to talk about spirituality around a dinner party. Everybody gets uncomfortable. They think you're a bit odd, and so these ideas about aging make a lot of people uncomfortable. I'm surprised very few people have disagreed, because commonly people don't like these ideas.
I wonder why that is so. Does society need that? Is it some sort of a safe rebel? Would it be general total chaotic anarchism?
Well, if things change, you don't have the security of things being the same. Yes.
With respect to older people becoming demented in their later years, if you look at the transition period that they're facing, and that through life and the process of death and the process of birth, perhaps the only way that they know how to face death is through their birthing process, and so they have to regress to that to a familiar situation.
Oh yeah, but that implies that they're doing it, that they're consciously making a choice to get dementia. I'm not sure whether that's true or not. But I'm very interested that we're all talking about dementia. I mean, I've spent this whole time talking about spirituality and the androgynous nature of God and the union of the opposites. And now we've had an enantiodromia into dementia. It's very interesting, that, isn't it? It's as if that up in the cloud stuff was too much and people wanted to talk about more earthy stuff. One more dementia question. Nobody wants to talk about the androgynous nature of God or androgynous consciousness.
Let's get to it.
Go on.
I had a very uncomfortable experience last night. I was out for dinner with some friends, and this woman was talking about her mother was in a nursing home with Alzheimer's. And because I'm a therapist, she was asking me about it. And we were talking, and I said to her, I said, well, what about you? We were talking about the next transition in life for Peter out of the house. She was going, and she says, I have nothing to look forward to. She says, my mother is doing this, and my grandmother had it. She says, what do I have, to look forward to?
So this lady hasn't got it yet herself, but
Her speech is terrible.
she thinks she's got it.
I think she thinks she has it.
Slurred speech is not an early symptom of Alzheimer's disease. She's got something else. Yeah. But I get, yeah. But I understand. The point is that, but she's living in. Maybe she drinks too much. But she's living in fear of. She's living in fear. She's living in the future, not in the present.
Yeah.
So, what was your question? What do you say?
I didn't know.
Yeah. Well, you can reassure her that most Alzheimer's disease is not hereditary. So there is a hereditary type of Alzheimer's disease, but there isn't anything like a. I mean, the chances are that she won't get it. Only 5% of people get it, and it's only slightly higher in the relatives of people with it. Okay, so that would be the matter-of-fact reassurance.
You spoke a little about losses and changes and so forth. Why does not the pattern of all of these losses include consciousness? Why doesn't that fit the pattern of loss? In other words, shouldn't that be...
Well, because you can't be conscious of your loss. You have to be. The question is that we were talking about the importance of losses, and that when you get dementia and you sort of lose the capacity to have higher consciousness, that's another form of loss. But you know, the important point about consciousness is to know that you're conscious, to be conscious of the fact that you're conscious. Yeah.
But according to hierarchy, the last thing maybe we have to sacrifice is our notion of what consciousness is. So that I can imagine a universe in which we must give up our consciousness.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you could certainly say, well, a demented person can't think the way we can, but that he has a different kind of consciousness that's not dependent on conceptual thought, but that he still has some quality of consciousness, and that we categorize that as bad. But that if we could have the proper perspective, it would just be a different kind of consciousness.
I don't believe that we have to delve as far as we can.
Yeah.
And then maybe we're not correct.
But the whole point about what I'm saying is that the ego helps to give birth to the self, or you help to give birth to the image of God inside you. That's the whole point about this. I am God's son and he is mine. You know, as Eckhart says, God is constantly being born in us. So, but for that to happen, in other words, the potentials of the self have to constantly be realized and incarnated. But it needs ego consciousness. God needs man and all that, those ideas. Well, yeah, but you can't do that if you don't have consciousness. That's the problem with dementia. So I see your point, that maybe we're just looking at it from a point of view that is a wrong point of view, but I don't know. I'm sorry, I'll have to think about that some more. I think this discussion of dementia has made me slightly uncomfortable because it's the one aspect of aging I really have paid very little attention to, and now I've realized why I haven't. So it's heightened my consciousness about this problem. Yeah.
So I would like to ask what are your thoughts about it, and also what is the second figure that will be missing?
Well, the dreamer, you see, the dreamer belongs in the missing. You see, this is a picture of the androgynous Godhead. And here's a male, she's a female.
Right.
So this is a human male, so the human female belongs in this corner, making up the triangle, and that was what I talked about. That's the... Well, because she has a choice. Because you see, what the unconscious does is it suggests a symbol to you, but it gives you a choice. It doesn't make you do it. Now, it doesn't make you do it consciously. If you don't do it, it'll happen to you. But it's better to make the choice consciously. It's like saying individuation can happen unconsciously. But she has the choice of doing it consciously, but she has to choose to do it and do it consciously. Okay. So it's saying that in old age, that the capital S self-development includes the development of androgynous consciousness, of the uniting of the opposites, of having masculine and feminine, all that. But that she has to achieve that herself. She has to put herself there, i.e. achieve it.
And yet, seeing the dreamer in the dream as being an old man, that's significant.
Yeah, well, the dream is a dream of aging.
Right. But just as well an old woman.
Well, if it was an old woman, it wouldn't be an exact analog, because she's the missing woman. She's the missing human. That's the point. It's got to be an analog to the image of the androgynous Godhead, which in the dream is said to be partly male and partly female. So it's like the male aspect is given, and she has to put herself in that other place. But I thought what would be interesting to discuss was what is the nature of androgynous consciousness? What does that mean? Nobody wants to talk about that? I'm not going to... Well, I think we should ask it means all kinds of things, but would you like to say what that means for you personally? Yeah.
One can think of androgynous consciousness also as that balance between ego, in which you are initiating something, and self, in which you are indeed receiving something. When you're in the process of or attacking the problem, for example, and the ego asks the question, if indeed you trust that the unconscious is going to provide an answer at the same time that you're searching, then that's another way.
Yeah, that would be another way of imaging it.
I would also carry the concept of androgynous beyond just the masculine and the feminine, as indeed, let's say, the Taoist, the symbol got it beyond the yin and yang to the level of the Tao. And I'd like to, in this regard, tell you a dream, and it was suggested to me by what you said, that suffering is the self seeking to incarnate.
It's the ego's experience of the self.
Yeah, which is a form of what Jung calls legitimate suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And but the problem is, if we deny that, then of course we have what he would so implicitly call illegitimate suffering.
Neurosis.
And I think there's a way of speaking about that ultimately in terms of androgyny, or in terms of what I would call the synchronistic dimension of androgyny, which is the Tao. The dream is a woman. This comes from an analyst in New York at this latest conference held two weekends ago, where she dreams about the death of her mother. And the dreamer is, that is, she is precognitively seeing the death of her mother. And of course realized that when the mother died a couple of weeks later. But the dream was such that it was this. She was on a swing. And then became aware suddenly that this swing was over a vast ocean. And that her swing was attached to a star. And she sees down on the water a boat coming, and a lone figure of the captain standing at the helm of the boat waiting. And then she's suddenly aware of the fact that her mother is on another equally giant cosmic swing with her swing attached to a star. And the mother is being filled slowly by all the stars in the heavens. And the dreamer knows that at the moment that her body, as it were, of the mother is filled with all of the stars, at that moment, the helmsman, the man at that boat, the watchman at death, is going to receive that.
Yeah, that's an incredible dream.
It's an incredible dream, and,
Yeah.
and I associated that with the last few pages.
The stars represent the archetypal realm, you see, and when she gets full of the star, then she dies. That would be an image of the fact that the ego comes out of that realm, and then at death the ego goes back into that realm, which is probably what happens in some way anyway. So that's remarkable, and we're all hanging from our own star. So that's a remarkable dream. Well, you know, the problem of understanding androgynous consciousness has to do with the problem of knowing the nature of masculinity and the nature of femininity. What do those principles mean? I mean, there are traditional stereotypes of logos and eros, masculinity meaning penetrating, decisive, assertive, knowing what you want and going out and getting it, consciousness, and femininity meaning receptive, nurturing, enclosing, all that, more static. You know, those images. Maybe those are correct, and maybe if you can really synthesize those so that they don't conflict with each other, that you get some state of consciousness that encloses both of those in a way where they don't conflict. Maybe that's what it means. That might be relevant to you, because it might be saying, integrate this more, integrate this other side more. I don't know whether those are correct images of masculinity and femininity or not. But the fact that this image is in all these creation myths is very remarkable. Yeah, question.
Could you explain again the meaning of the God being youngest when we're older?
Oh, yeah, the voice says, as we get older, God gets younger, and when we die, God is reborn. Now, one aspect of that is saying death isn't the end, that you should see your own life in relation to eternity. Another aspect of it is that as we get older, that we get more like the child, except that unlike the child, we are differentiated and conscious. When we're a baby, but we are like the child in that all those original potentials that existed as potential in the baby now exist fully in the world incarnated. But it's the same as the child, because all that is there again, and not in a one-sided way, the way it was in midlife. So we are in late life the same as we were in childhood, except developed and incarnated and fully differentiated and fully conscious. And also that we are helping that process So God is constantly getting born. That means that when we realize a bit about the self from an image, and we expand our own consciousness, we get more like the self, because Jung says that the ego is a model of the self. And if we just knew everything that was in the self, if the ego just knew everything was like, it would be a perfect model of the self. Then man would be a perfect model of God. That's what it means to say that we are created in the image of God. It means that the ego is a perfect analog for the self, or man is a perfect analog for God, and yet man is not God. There's some paradox in there, but it's referring to the fact that we get more and more like God, who was there at present, who was present at birth in the baby as a potential self. Okay, and now it becomes all that realized in the world, but it's the same. You get the point? That's how yeah. Oh, sure. That's where we stop.
Commentary today is by Peter Demuth, Psy.D, Jungian Analyst in private practice in Evanston, Illinois. More information about Dr. Demuth can be found at demuthpsychologicalservices.com.
Hi, this is Dr. Peter Demuth from the Chicago Society of Jungian Analysts, and I just listened to the fourth segment of Lionel Corbett's lecture on archetypal and pre-egoic defenses. What really kind of got my interest was the fact that a lot of the material discussed in this lecture seemed to predate Donald Cowshed's work on the self-care system. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, I heartily recommend Donald Cowshed's book, The Inner World of Trauma. And I think that will kind of illuminate and give you some more ideas about this. One of the things that kind of gets me really interested in the pre-egoic defenses was the fact that I have a adopted son from Guatemala, which my wife and I adopted at age 9 months. And one of the things I was wondering about is what were his early experiences before he came to our place or came to our home in America? What were his experiences? Were they good? Were they nurturing? And how would they play out in his life, especially since they had happened before he had the power to describe his life in language? They were, in other words, they happened before he had the ability to talk. So I was really interested in this conversation because it gave me some new ideas about how to think about that. Also, I had recently attended a workshop on integrative hypnosis, and what they talked about was really interesting as well, because they talked about how to access different levels of the soma. And of course, the soma has a different language unto itself other than the language of the ego. But there are certain words and certain ways that you can talk to the psyche where that language can actually communicate to places in the soma, such as the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, or the amygdala. And using certain words and certain phrases, you can kind of actually communicate directly with those places in the body that aren't really regulated by the ego. But I found that very interesting and probably also connected to this lecture. Finally, at the end, Corbett was talking about this case where a little girl was sent to call her father for dinner, and she came back and told her mother that she wasn't able to call the father. And eventually, after the mother sending the daughter 3 times, she went with the daughter to find out why the daughter couldn't bring the father. And they come to find out that the father is slumped in a chair and he's had a heart attack. And so the reason the girl couldn't go into the room is it was blocked by this angel, which Corbett referred to as the guardian angel. So the guardian angel was an archetypal defense that came up out of the psyche, sent by the self, and disallowed the entrance of the girl into the room because she would not be able to handle the trauma. And so until the mother came with her and the mother would be there to help her deal with the trauma, the angel wouldn't let her in. There are 2 other stories about the same kind of phenomenon. The first one is the story of the little match girl. And in it, she's trying to stay warm and she's starving and she's cold. And she has this image of her grandmother who invites her into this place in the psyche that's warm and protective. But in so going there, she ends up freezing to death. But this was the archetypal defense, or the angel inviting her there in order for her not to experiencing more trauma. such as being beaten by her father or more, frozen, frostbite or whatever it was. So that's an example of the archetypal angel that results in death. There's another example that takes place in the movie Gravity, where Sandra Bullock's partner, George Clooney, he dies and he drifts off into space, and during a moment of depression and hopelessness, Sandra Bullock decides that she's going to die too, so she turns off all the life support systems in the airplane or the aircraft. But then George Clooney comes back to her via her psyche. He comes out from her own archetypal place and wakes her up out of her stupor, and then motivates her to save herself. So there are two more examples of what Corbett was talking about with the guardian angel. Anyway, found the lecture to be fascinating. Make sure you review Donald Cowshed's book, The Inner World of Trauma, if you haven't. And if you get a chance, read Hans Christian Sanderson, The Little Match Girl, and also see the movie Gravity. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. The content of today's lecture is copyright of Lionel Corbett. If you are interested in hearing more lectures by Lionel Corbett, please visit our audio downloads page at audio.jungchicago.org. This podcast is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Share it all you like as long as you maintain the attribution to the speaker, but please do not change it or sell it. If you are interested in attending seminars taught by Jungian Analysts, our 5-part series, Transformative Encounters, Meeting the Other in Inner and Outer Life, begins September 26th. For more information about this and our other courses, visit our website, www.jungchicago.org. If you like this episode, tell your friends about us or leave us a review on iTunes. I'm Ben Law, the editor of the podcast, and I'll see you next time.